Hi, and thank you for tuning into Noir Histoire. I'm Natasha, and in this episode, I'll be discussing Yonder. Yonder by Jabari Asim is in a sense a slave narrative, but it differs from others as it doesn't just follow one particular character, but rather a group. And specifically, a group comprised of people who share typical relationships that we might take for granted. Within the group are two sets of couples who share romantic love at different stages, a couple of soon-to-be parents anxious about the birth of their child, and another couple apprehensive about taking a chance to find love in a new relationship after multiple heartbreaks, and then overall friendship between all of the members of the group. From the moment I began reading, this book reminded me of The Water Dancer. It's kind of eye-opening because quite often when you read slave narratives or read about slavery, given how precarious relationships could be, as family members or friends could be sold off without any kind of notice, there's a lot more focus on the individual rather than on familial ties. So that in and of itself makes this book a little bit different because so much of the focus of the book is on the relationships between these people and telling their individual stories, sure, but also their interactions. We get some understanding, insight into, obviously enslaved people would have loved and wanted to be loved because they were human beings. But because quite often, aside from slave narratives, much of the stories that we get about enslaved people was from the slave masters or people on the outside observing them, and less frequently enslaved people themselves, describing their circumstances, their lives, their inner thoughts and whatnot, you kind of get a skewed perception of things. So much of the book focuses on the relationships between these people. It really helps to humanize them in a way that you don't get in other books. Let's say outside of slave narratives, where you specifically have like the formerly enslaved speaking about their experiences. In books about like more historical type books by abolitionists who were more further removed from life on plantations, from the actual experience of being enslaved, you wouldn't be able to get these kinds of insights. There would automatically be some degree of distance because being on the outside looking in, you wouldn't be able to speak to what it's like to be a child and have your parents sold away from you, or to be ripped away from your friends, to be separated from all of the people that you love, that you've grown up with. And so with these books, in reading them, they've given a different perspective where obviously this is a work of fiction, but kind of taking a more humanistic look into the lives of the enslaved, less from a policy and like economic perspective, which is what you get from like a lot of the abolitionist books, where, through these experiences, there's only so much that they can really offer insight-wise. But here it puts you into the mind frame of what it might have felt like to be enslaved and living under these circumstances. The book is imaginative. It calls on you to use your imagination to put yourself in the shoes of these individuals and imagine what it might have been like to be a young man or a young woman at this time. You begin taking an interest in the opposite sex, things that we take for granted, right? Teenage puppy love, things of that nature. What it might have been like to go through those things, to have those natural urges and feelings, curiosities, but with this added pressure of your life not being your own. Not because your parents are like over you or you're accountable to your parents, but rather because you live within a system that doesn't grant you autonomy, that doesn't recognize your humanity, your being an individual, you having thoughts and feelings. And so it puts you in the mind frame of imagining what it might have been like. You can't help but to read, and as these individuals are like pretty young, they're in their teens to early 20s or so, to imagine when you were that age, having your first teenage crushes, maybe dating your first girlfriend, your first boyfriend, dealing with that, but then also this added pressure of your life not being your own. Not having the choice or the option really of choosing your first sexual partner, not being able to just have the freedom to be in adolescence and go through these life experiences because every aspect of your life is controlled. Someone else dictates when you go, when you come, what you can do, what you can't do in life, eating, even the most basic functions. It's all controlled by someone else. And then you have the precariousness of your relationships, that even things that we take for granted, having a mother, a father, siblings, the experience of having love from your mother, love from your father, that all of that can be stripped away at someone else's whim, or someone else deciding that because they want to buy something or they've run into financial problems that they can cut your family ties. They can cut you off from your mother, separate you from your father, whatever other family members that you might have. You meet someone, you fall in love with someone. Would you even allow yourself such feelings? Would you even take such a chance knowing that it can all be whisked away? It's something that makes you really sit and think. Slavery was not just this physical thing, right? Someone having physical ownership over you, dictating when you can get up, when you can go to sleep, where you can go, where you can't go, forcing you to work for the betterment of someone else. It was all of that, but so much more. So it's like the physical enslavement, right? But the book actually, in exploring these relationships, dives deeper into the emotional aspect of that as well, right? Being emotionally, men being especially vulnerable, where because they have the ability to dictate these aspects about your life, even from an emotional standpoint, the relationships in your life, you don't have control over that either. Often in the present, when we go through things in life, because you have friends, you have family members that you can turn to, people that you can rely on, you can talk to about your problems, whether that's an older family member that you can go to for guidance, your siblings, your parents, your friends, that in your time of need, when you need emotional support, you have these relationships, these people that you can turn to. But imagine, right, going through just like day-to-day life, living under this system, living under these circumstances where even that isn't afforded to you. Because from a very young age, you can be ripped away from your mother. You can be separated from your father and vice versa. As a parent that has brought a child into the world, has had this child that they love, these children are not yours to really raise. You're accountable to someone else. You have to answer to someone else with regards to raising your children. So often you hear mothers talk about when they give birth to children and raise them. Yes, they go on to become adults, but in that mother's eyes, in that father's eyes, they're still your baby. You worry about them. You're concerned about them. It's a natural inclination. Now imagine that still applies, but that your child can be taken away from you. This child that you've carried for 9 months that you love can be taken away from you and you never see them again. That from your own experience, what you've seen and gone through in life, being worried about your children going through these things, knowing what they might face in the world, the difficulties, the dangers that they might face in the world. And here it is, they can be taken away from you. You still have these worries, you still have these concerns, but you no longer have your children. It's heart-wrenching how devastating that would be. Reading this book, the story is actually really amazing. But at the same time that I was reading, I found myself kind of putting myself in the shoes of these characters. Certainly there's a bit of a fantastical type thing at play here, but on a basic level, putting myself in the shoes of these characters, of the enslaved people in general, thinking about how I would feel in such a situation. And it's like, I can't even fathom trying to survive in such a world. The more I read about history, the more I stand in awe of the people that came before me, the people who lived through slavery. It's incredible to me that not just the physical things that they endured, but the mental and emotional strain, and that they survived. It's inspiring when you think about it. The early part of the book focuses on exploring the characters, giving you a feel for them, kind of introducing you to the various characters. You have William, who I believe is the first character we meet. We meet him as a little boy who's been separated from his family, sold into slavery. He arrives onto this plantation as a boy, where he then comes into contact with some of the other main characters. And we then get an understanding of each of their backgrounds. So William is brought to Placid Hall, a plantation that's owned by a slave master, Cannonball Green, and his wife, who they refer to as Screech Owl. Now, these two, obviously, they'd be problematic, to say the least, because they own people, but they're both extra in being despicable. Cannonball Green is a man who is, first off, there's some tension between Cannonball and his wife, Screech Owl. The reason being that not only is Cannonball a slave trader, within this book, the slave masters are referred to as thieves and the enslaved the stolen, which is a pretty nice touch, right? Because it calls the thing a thing. It's a better description of the true nature of this setup, where here you have these people who have been stolen away from Africa into bondage, the individuals who have played a part in stealing them away from their homeland, stealing them away from, their lives, liberty, labor. It's actually a very good description. And it seems like such a small thing, but when I read it for the first time, it was like, okay, this actually makes perfect sense. It's like the perfect descriptor for the situation at hand. So you have Cannonball Green. He's not just a slave master in the sense of he has these people toiling away for him that he doesn't pay, but he also takes advantage of his position to take advantage of the enslaved women on his plantation, forcing himself on these women, kind of cycling through them and disposing of them as sexual playthings. And as part of this, his wife, Screech Owl, being aware of what's taking place, instead of holding him accountable for his wrongdoings, takes out some of her frustration, her jealousy, really anger on these various women. In a sense, it kind of reminded me of the book 12 Years a Slave, where you had this similar dynamic, where first off, I would think that you would automatically question the morals of any individual that would seek to own another human being. I would think that you'd have to be morally bankrupt. Your principles and scruples are certainly skewed, if not non-existent. If you could somehow talk yourself into the idea of it being acceptable for you to own another human being, that's the first thing. So it should automatically let you know the character of this man. But then beyond that, that he further transgresses, by being a sexual predator. If you would take advantage of another person in this way to force them into labor, I don't think it's much of a leap that you would also take advantage and force yourself onto women in this group, especially because the system is set up in such a way where it allows the slave masters, or in this case, the thieves, to exert ultimate control over other human beings. And as we see here, and we've seen throughout history, I think that for the most part, under most circumstances, people are generally good. But when put into positions of having absolute authority over others, you're really taking a chance that people in such positions won't abuse their authority. And as we've seen throughout history, the individuals who do not take advantage are more often few and far between. I do not believe that any one human being is so good and capable that they should have dominion over other people, because it's this idea of absolute power corrupts absolutely, where when you take one human being and you put them out there in the world, there's a good chance they might be good. There's a chance they might be bad. It really depends on who they are as a person, how they develop, the environment in which they develop. But when you take a person and you put them into such an environment, you give them absolute authority over other people, I think there's a very good chance that many would absolutely take advantage of that. I don't think that it's good for the development of that person. I'm not excusing it, and I don't feel sorry for slave traders, but I think placed in such a situation, in circumstances where especially if you've grown up in such an environment, I think that there's a far more likely chance that you're going to end up being a despicable human being who will take advantage of those under you, largely because it's probably been ingrained within you that this is your birthright, that it's acceptable for you to treat people in this way, especially because you don't regard them as being people. If you're willing to take advantage of people in one area and in one way, I don't think it's such a big leap that you'd be unwilling to take advantage of them in multiple ways. And so here you have it, that Cannonball, he exploits the stolen, right? Their labor by having them work and not paying them, having them work from sunup to sundown and whatnot under the threat of violence at the hands of his overseers. I don't think it's much of a leap that he would then also use his position and authority to sexually exploit the vulnerable women on his plantation. The women who are really, of all the people in his plantation, are vulnerable because, society dictates that he has the right to take advantage of them. And being women, but even with the men as well, because they don't really have any power or authority without some great risk to themselves to stand up and defend themselves, much less to stand up and, defend the other women, children, and whatnot on the plantation. And this kind of goes for everyone, where the system is set up for Cannonball to be able to take advantage of anyone under his ownership on his plantation, men, women, children included, and also his own wife. And then you have his wife, who is also complicit in this, right? Given her standing in society. I'm not saying that she's not necessarily a victim, but she's not a victim in the same sense as the enslaved. Her situation, by virtue of her gender at this time, is a bit different than Cannonball's, where she's put in a position of being elevated over the enslaved. But at the same time, she's not standing on equal footing with Cannonball. So in that sense, she has dominion over the enslaved, but doesn't stand as equals with her husband. And so with that, when he does things that upsets her, she can't really strike out at him. So being a bully and a coward, she instead strikes out at the enslaved. So when she's upset about her husband cheating on her, for lack of a better word, in her view, with these enslaved women, really he's like sexually assaulting them and sexually exploiting them. She's not in a position to exert any kind of revenge on him, at least not directly. And so instead, she takes it out on the enslaved. She takes it out on the enslaved women, probably due to her own frustrations in life. I guess kind of like pushing back against her husband, right? Or venting by brutalizing and abusing the enslaved. So it's like, you don't feel sorry for her with the way the book is written. I don't think that you're supposed to, but it kind of becomes this thing of hurt people, where she sounds like she's got a few screws loose either way. But in this position where she's married to this man who's constantly upsetting her, who's, for lack of a better term, being unfaithful to her, lacking any recourse, she can't strike out at him directly. So she strikes out at those who are more vulnerable and in a weaker position. Her husband injures her pride, and she in turn tries to take out revenge on the people on the plantation. Not to excuse their actions, to garner sympathy for them, but I think it's this thing where even reading like abolitionist texts, slave narratives and whatnot, slavery is something that damages not just the enslaved, but also the enslavers. Because for you as a human being to own another human being, to lord over another human being, to brutalize another human being, it takes a certain kind of person to carry out such measures. You have to debase yourself. You have to become less of a human being for you to treat other people this way. For you to rape or otherwise sexually assault someone, for you to brutalize either personally or to give orders for another human being to be brutalized, it requires you to lack some bit of humanity. Whether that's something that comes to you by nature or it's something that develops as a result of growing up in this environment, the end result is the same. For you to survive in this world, and I'm certainly not excusing it because you have the option to do otherwise, but for you to exist within this environment and function within this environment, to follow these rules willingly, it takes a certain kind of person. You have to be a certain kind of person to rationalize this kind of behavior in your mind, and for you to carry out these kinds of tasks, for you to take it upon yourself to accept this is how you want to conduct yourself, because you have options. It's like, sure, you grew up in this environment, but in coming of age, especially with Cannonball, it's like you would have the option to conduct yourself otherwise, but you instead choose to live in this way, brutalizing other people, taking advantage of other people. I don't feel for him. I'm not here playing like the world's tiniest violin for you, but it really just shows, it's like, I can't remember where I read the phrase, but basically, there's no one human being who's so perfect and beyond reproach that their character makes it such where they should have dominion over another human being. And I think this book certainly points to that. So here at play, you have the relationships between the different characters. I don't really want to give away too much of the story, but really just to speak about the broader themes. But there's a bit of fantasy at play here. So you have this belief where those who were stolen away from Africa, that they could take flight, and they're referred to as the Bubayali. So these like mythical captured Africans. And the belief is that those who were enslaved during the time of the book are like Bubayali, or the descendants of them. But it's just that they've forgotten that they're magical, that deep down inside they have the ability to fly, to take flight and escape. And so that becomes a major theme in the book, where you have these individuals living on this plantation, living in bondage. And so we get some insight into their day-to-day lives, right? The realities of being enslaved, of being a stolen person. And they're kind of going through the humdrum, the motions of this day-to-day living. And really, it's not living. It's more so trying to survive. Events take place in the book that push them towards, well, they meet each other, right? The characters in the book. But they meet another character, Preacher, who in coming into contact with him, they have some experiences that push them towards thinking of Yonder, right? Life in a sense beyond the plantation. what Yonder is, what it promises, the physical location, the idea of how to manifest it varies from person to person. But pretty much what it is that it pushes them towards thinking of life beyond the here and now, beyond this immediate moment, beyond living on the plantation. What are the possibilities? And with that, they begin thinking of freedom. Through coming into contact with Preacher, who's really an enslaved man who has created this new identity for himself, and kind of goes from plantation to plantation, speaking to the enslaved, they begin to think about Yonder. Here at Placid Hall Plantation, going through the day-to-day, of living in bondage, they start to imagine and think about what life could be like beyond the confines of Placid Hall, beyond the control of Cannonball and his wife, getting past this stuff, what freedom might be like. After getting some insight into their backgrounds, we then gain an understanding of what it means to be enslaved, the experience on a day-to-day basis of being owned by another human, the reality of what that might have been like, what that might have felt like. As the story unfolds, it starts to go from this thing of them really just existing in the here and now on the plantation to starting to gain an understanding of their hopes and dreams, having hopes and dreams that they can work for themselves. They begin exploring the possibilities of Yonder, moving beyond their current state in both the physical and emotional sense. A chief part of that is freedom, or freedom is the ultimate goal. And exploring that freedom has a different meaning for each one of them, because the things that they want on a basic level are pretty much the same, right? Which is to have control over themselves. They'd like to be able to love without the fear of losing that love, to really just on a basic level live life rather than merely surviving. And a huge part of that becomes these things that we don't really have to worry about, right? Just basic things, having control over their lives. It's not like they have grand visions of becoming millionaires, having like a fancy horse or something like that. It's just the freedom to be, to live, to love, to be themselves, to not be under someone else's control. With that, they begin to define Yonder for themselves. Yonder becomes intertwined with freedom, both in the physical and emotional sense, the mental sense as well. And so the third part of the book, the final act of the book, becomes them actually, for lack of a better term, taking flight. Going back to this thing of the Bubiali, where Xander, who's the youngest of the group, he's actually a rather lovable character. He's a little bit younger than the other characters. He's really just a boy. But he spends a lot of his time running, jumping, in hopes that when the time comes for him to take flight, for him to reclaim this history of being a part of this mythical group, that he'll be prepared. And so him, along with the other main characters, William, Cato, Pandora, Margaret, they eventually decide to flee the plantation because remaining has become especially dangerous given recent events. And so with that, the best course of action for them becomes to take flight. The book kind of shifts gears at that point. Throughout the book, it's interesting, but in the third part, like when they're escaping, the tension that exists early in the book, you kind of have like this mounting tension really throughout the book. But it really shifts into overdrive in the last part of the book when they fled the plantation, where the wrong thing that you say, the wrong look, this or that, coming into contact with like the overseer or, anyone else could mean danger. It's like this thing of just one wrong step and you can put yourself in serious problems, right? So there's that ongoing tension. But that was like brewing below the surface. Now it's out in the open. Having run away, the threat level has ratcheted up several times over. And it makes for like a really interesting story. I like the characters throughout, and I enjoyed getting to know the 5 main characters. But it's like, there's a degree to which even some of the other characters don't know them, but having that insight made it feel like you knew the characters all the better, right? You understand their inner motivations. It really made me enjoy the book all the more. I enjoyed reading this book. I love the characters. I love the character development. I like the way that not just the characters are written as individuals, but the overall writing style. It's a book that, although there's moments early on that kind of pull at your emotional heartstrings, it becomes incredibly action-packed in the last third, yet the author manages to keep your attention throughout the book. It's just a great book from start to finish. It's just that it shifts gears as you move through the story. So it's like, in the first part of the book, you spend time getting to know the characters, understanding their backstories, getting a feel for the plantation, life on the plantation. And then it's like events occur that start to ratchet up the tension to the point where when you get to the last third of the book, it's breakneck speed, full speed ahead. So I enjoyed reading the book. I think it's definitely worth checking out. It's a great fictional companion piece to like slave narratives and abolitionist texts because it's so imaginative. It calls on you to use your imagination to put yourself in the shoes of the enslaved, like what they might have experienced to gain a better understanding. And so with that, I highly recommend this book. Thanks for tuning in. Show notes are available on the Noir Histoire website via the link in the episode description. If you enjoyed this episode and want more book recommendations, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my book review playlist.